Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Gruniger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start with a message from today's sponsor. Step into the captivating world of Mary, Queen of Scots with Simply Tudor Tours, who are thrilled to announce the launch of their brand new From Crown to Captivity tour, which will take place between the 11th and the 17th of May, 2026. Join the tour for a mesmerising journey through Scotland's most iconic sites. Your guides, Sarah Morris from the Tudor Travel Guide and Adam Pennington from the Tudor Chest, will be accompanied by guest historian in residence Anna Turnham from the University of Kent. Along with several on-location experts on Mary's life, they'll unravel the events of her dramatic tale as participants explore pivotal locations like Linlithgow Palace, Stirling Castle, and the foreboding Loch Leven. Highlights include an exclusive boat trip across Loch Leven, a private tour of the Palace of Holyrood House, and for an extra dose of fun Scotland style, a five-star whiskey tasting tour and storytelling date on the final evening. Experience the grandeur, intrigue, and tragedy of Mary's story. Grab your place now and let history come alive. Visit Simply Tudor Tours for more details. Of course, I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast, if you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Gareth Russell back to the show to chat about his new book, Queen James. Gareth is a historian and broadcaster. He studied at Oxford and Queen's University Belfast, where he specialised in the medieval and Tudor royal households. He's the author of several books, including the Catherine Howard biography, Young and Damned and Fair, and The Palace, From the Tudors to the Windsors. His latest book is Queen James, The Life and Loves of Britain's First King. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Gareth, welcome back to Talking Tudors. How are you?
I'm very well, Natalie. Thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, it's always such a pleasure to speak with you. And this is an exciting episode because we're talking about another magnificent book that you've produced. But before we dive into that, can you just say hello to everyone and just tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Yeah, of course. Well, hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be back here. It's always a very enjoyable interview to do. And also your audience is lovely, which makes a big, big difference.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, my name is Gareth Russell, as Natalie said, and I'm a historian. I've worked on quite a few books in the 16th and now 17th century. My postgraduate was on sort of mid 16th century monarchy and court, particularly in Catherine Howard's household. But I've also written books, as well as the biography of Catherine Howard, Young and Damned and Fair. My most recent book before this was called The Palace, which was about the history of Hampton Court Palace, which told through a different room, different decade in each new chapter. And my most recent book has been out in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Republic of Ireland since the tail end of February, where it's called Queen James, and it'll be coming out in Canada and the United States in December under the sort of direct riposte to Henry VIII title of The Six Loves of James I.
Wonderful. And I'm so glad us Aussies weren't left out off the list this time. It's wonderful.
Yeah,
Sometimes we
it's
have to
funny because
wait, don't we? But yeah, we were
yeah,
pretty
I
lucky.
think what I have seen, it's quite this has been quite an interesting learning curve with this book about just the way things work in an international market, and in particular, more than half the book is set when James is King of Scots and living in Scotland. and solely King of Scots, I should say. And so it that bit is technically, it's Stuart in Scotland, but it's the Tudor era. It's the Elizabethan era elsewhere in the British Isles. So, but this book has been classed as Stuart history. And what was
Mm.
quite interesting when we sold the book, a few years ago, to different publishers, it meant a lot because there is a it meant a lot that the publishers in North America had the faith in it that they did because the Stuarts traditionally really don't do well in the North American market. I mean, they're only really just beginning to have a moment in the British, Australian, and Kiwi market that we can see here. But when we so the reason for the two very different titles, which can be a bit of a pain to promote on social media, but what was quite nice was when we were sitting down to talk about it, the North American publishers had said, we've read it and we think this story is every bit as fascinating as Henry VIII and his six wives. Can we come up with something that maybe gives a nod to North American audiences about that? And so it was just interesting because this is the first time I've done a period that has sort of different receptions on
Yeah.
both sides of the Atlantic. Um, or both sides of the Pacific, and it was very, very intriguing to see that the Stuarts are sort of just beginning to gather a momentum, which is exciting. But I did quite enjoy giving a title that was a sort of metaphorical headbutt to Henry VIII. That I was not displeased. But yeah,
Well, I fully
it's been
support
quite
any headbutting of Henry VIII, Gareth, so thank you.
yeah. Yeah, so yeah, enthusiastically, and yeah, it's quite interesting to see sort of and this is the first time I did the audio for my own books. So it's been a really exciting learning curve for it.
Oh, I'm so delighted to hear that. And I'm also interested to know, because you've already pointed out that you've written a book about Palace, Hampton Court. Obviously, that
Mm.
features some Tudor history there.
Yeah.
You've written an excellent biography of Catherine Howard, of course. And now, although you've said half the book is set in the 16th
Mm.
century, you have moved into the Stuart period. So what inspired that kind of move? Or is James someone you've always been interested in?
No, he hasn't. It actually was the first book you mentioned, which was The Palace, that started it. So the palace is subdivided right into sort of four sections. And the House of Stuart, what its 17th and early 18th century experience, had three chapters when James was in residence there. One about his first Christmas as King of England at Hampton Court, one about the Hampton Court Conference when he commissioned the authorized translation of the King James translation of the Bible, and one about the death of his wife, Anna of Denmark, at Hampton Court in 1619. And when you do a lot of research for chapters like that don't end up going in the book, you have to sort of know more than you end up including. And I was fascinated by him and by the whole period, and left that section of the book to move on to the Civil War and his son Charles the First with reluctance, not because the Civil War and Charles the First aren't fascinating, but because there just seemed to be so much more to say on James, and it's an improbable, remarkable life. I mean, all royal lives are different. They are, if not unique, certainly unusual. But James's life, even within the context of being a royal in the 16th and 17th century, is unusually dramatic, and he acknowledged that himself. So it just seemed to me that James really was the perfect intersection of interesting and important. So when I was sitting down to really think about uh, what to do next, it was one of I had sort of James in the back of my mind, but in sort of a gathering of historians, I don't know what the proper term is, but it was sort of Leander Delisle, who's written brilliant books in the period, um, was hosting a sort of lunch get together, and Elizabeth Fremantle, who many people will know from, she wrote the novel that Firebrand, the movie, is based on, but she has also written some really excellent novels set in the 17th century, one of which is about one of James's lovers, Robert Carr. And I was sort of talking about what I wanted to do next and mentioned that I was still, fascinated by James. It was Elizabeth who said, I really think that that there's a gap and a need for a biography of him that isn't sort of too coy and writes about him in a forthright, honest way. And I think you should do it. And that's sort of that if the palace planted the seed, it was Elizabeth that germinated it. So that's where it
No.
came together.
What a wonderful story. And I want to start at the beginning, really, Gareth, if we can, with a little bit of background information on James. And you mentioned there that it's a dramatic story. So tell us about some of those dramas, those traumas that he endures and witnesses growing up.
Yeah, when he's in his 30s, he says a remarkable thing that all royalty has been subject to sort of the winds of tempest, the winds of turmoil and the tempests of change since they were born. But he has been exposed to all that since before, even I may say, whilst I was still in my mother's belly, is how he puts it. So when he's still in utero, his mother, Mary, has a pistol pointed at him and her by a plotter at Holyrood House in the spring of 1566, when his universally detested English father, Lord Darnley, joins a plot to murder Mary, Queen of Scots' Italian confidant David Rizzio, and they do it in front of her. And to stop Mary helping him, they point a loaded pistol at her pregnant womb. And unfortunately, that does set the scene for what it will be like for James and his mother Mary for the first few months of his life. So when he's still in the cradle, he's born at Edinburgh Castle, but almost immediately sent, I should say, to Stirling Castle, which if anyone, I know many of your listeners love to sort of visit historical sites. I cannot, I don't work for them, though sometimes it sounds like I do. I'm so enthusiastic. I cannot encourage anyone who loves the 16th century or palaces or castles more than to go to Stirling Castle in Scotland. It is absolutely extraordinary. The Great Hall is still in use. The chapel that James had built there is still how it would have looked when he was there. And they have also restored, I think, one of the greatest restorations I've ever seen, which is the royal apartments at Stirling are fully restored to look as they would have looked in the 1530s when James V and Mary of Guise are there. I mean, it's remarkable. But that is where James spends most of his childhood, and there's a reason for that. First of all, Stirling's views are incredible because it's on a crag. It is the idea of besieging it borders on the impossible. And there's a long tradition of Scottish royal children being sent there. And he's sort of out of the way while his father is murdered, his mother is deposed. And he's 13 months old when the largely Presbyterian Protestant faction that have deposed Mary, Queen of Scots, and sort of driven her into exile in England seize control of the Scottish government and proclaim the infant James VI, King of Scots. And for the next roughly 13 years, he is kept at Stirling with no say or interest in politics. He is given an excellent education. And for a very long time, I think there was a pervasive idea that James's childhood was almost sort of pseudo-Dickensian and miserable. And there has been some good work recently about the people who were working at Stirling when he was there throughout the 1570s. And yes, absolutely, it's sort of quite a relief to report that it wasn't all miserable. He had a governess, the Countess of Mar, MAR, who just adored him and slept in his bedroom until he was 10 and was very protective of him, shaping friends with his mother and his grandmother, Mary of Guise. So she was a Stuart loyalist. And he nicknamed her Lady Minnie, which Minnie's I went looking sort of in arcane dictionaries for what it meant, and it was a 16th century Scottish colloquialism for mummy. So in
Mhm.
many ways, he's almost like a child of adoption. He doesn't have any memory of his biological mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, but he calls his governess Lady Mummy. And he's sort of seen walking around the ramparts holding her hand, talking about his favorite book and things like that. And he has two physical educators, Adam and David Erskine, who teach him how to play football, which he's very good at. He has little mini golf clubs to play, at Canvas, Kenneth and Dryborough, which are nearby. He is a brilliant horseman, and the Erskines teach him how to ride horses and hunt, and he loves falconry as well. And the one lesson he doesn't love, which I found quite funny when I went researching, there are four Englishmen at the castle, the Hudson brothers, this quartet of musical brothers, and the household records record that they get a bonus payment from the royal household for what is described as the extraordinary pain they had to take in teaching James how to dance because he hates it. And
I love that.
yeah, that really that's little human things in the records,
Yeah,
maybe,
yeah.
or they really do reach out. But uh, I think that's really important that we acknowledge that it was not uniformly miserable. Unfortunately, I think sometimes that's led a little bit to an overcorrection in saying, well, actually, he wasn't. There was just really one person who was horrible to him at Stirling, and that's true. There was only one. But if we're writing about it today or at any time, we know that it only takes one for abuse to be perpetrated or to be sort of a painful fly in the ointment. And in James's case, his really excellent education in languages, religion, history, statecraft are divided between two tutors. Peter Young, who is had studied in Switzerland, is very gentle. James has a lot of time for Peter Young and will later employ Peter to tutor his own children. But the senior tutor, the one who is given history and Latin, which are really the spines of James's education, is a Scottish intellectual called George Buchanan. And Buchanan's impact on the role of sort of the later Scottish Renaissance, the flourishing of learning at the university at St Andrews is very important. He was extremely intelligent and, at least earlier in his life, very likable. Whether he become a little bit crabbier, to put it mildly, as he got older, I don't know. What was interesting was he seemed to be quite nice to the other young aristocratic boys sent to Stirling, but he was awful to James. I mean, we have to be careful, I think, things like abuse or prejudice or any of those things. We have to be careful not to use our own standards for them. So if I ever refer to someone as abusive, it will be if they are exceeding what is considered normal at the time. And it's, of course, most of the things done to 16th century children would raise an
Mm,
eyebrow today. You know, there is um, there's no doubt in contemporary minds that corporal punishment is in a child's benefit. There's an enduring myth, which is completely fabricated, that royal children, particularly princes, had something called a whipping boy who would be
yes.
beaten in lieu for them. And that myth seems to start percolating with Edward VI and an Irish aristocrat at his court, called Barnaby Fitzpatrick. And Barnaby did not perform that role. And in fact, it never existed. And the
Mhm,
reason it never existed is that it would have been considered in the young prince's um, interest to be
mhm,
beaten, okay, when he misbehaved, partly because you don't want a king who can't handle physical pain, considering they might have to lead an army. And secondly, you spare the rod, you spoil the child. And that is contemporary wisdom. So Buchanan was entitled to and expected to physically discipline his pupils. It is very clear from the actions of Lady Mar, that James's governess, that he, on at least one occasion, probably many more times, seriously overstepped the boundary of what was considered an appropriate level of physical discipline. And at one point, James answered back in class, and Buchanan started beating him so severely that James's screams alerted Lady Mar from another part of the castle to come and pull Buchanan off him. You know, when James is crying because a pet has died, Buchanan slaps him and makes fun of him. He repeatedly refers to his mother as a harlot in the classes. He has sort of anti-Mary lessons. He he is really awful to James. And well into his 40s, James will still refer to Buchanan as the benchmark of cruelty in his mind. And when he's in his 30s, he spots a man across the room who looked uncannily like George Buchanan, who by this point had been dead for decades. And James started physically shaking from head to
um,
toe. So, on the one hand, the childhood at Stirling is not as miserable, uniformly miserable, as traditional accounts would have it. There were kind people and good people there, and there were happy memories. However, he had a rigorous education, which meant he was in the classroom a lot, which meant he was in George Buchanan's um, custody almost quite a lot. And there's no doubt in my mind that Buchanan did real emotional damage to James. So in the world beyond Scotland, beyond Stirling, while all this is going on, there are a series of regents. His uncle, Lord Murray, who many will remember from Mary Queen of Scots' life story, is briefly regent, though he's assassinated. Then James's grandfather on his father's side, Lord Lennox, becomes regent. He too is shot and killed. Then James's governor, Lord Mar, is asked to step in, and the job is so stressful it kills him within a year. And then finally, James's grim but very competent distant cousin, Lord Morton, becomes regent. And at that point, there's sort of an end of the chaos that has been coup and counter coup since Mary Queen of Scots fled. And it's a more peaceful
Mm.
environment. So by the time James emerges from Stirling to start to perform more public duties like opening Parliament in Edinburgh in the autumn of 1579, there has been what George Buchanan calls peace. A ticklish peace, but quiet from armed struggle. So that's sort of his
Mm.
childhood in a nutshell.
So, Gareth, tell us a little bit about how that sort of uncertainty that is born into that brutality that you've described, how all those experiences manifest in the adult, the king, James. Yeah, maybe just some examples there.
Yeah, he is someone who, quite interestingly, given his support for one witch hunt in particular, he is someone who is very skeptical of torture. So he believes that if you hurt someone, they will say whatever you need them to say to stop. And I have sometimes wondered, did that come from, sort of the enforced apology to Buchanan? He is someone I think quite interestingly as he emerges into the life of Scottish politics, and this will continue. He is someone who wants a very loyal base around him. I think he is on the one hand trying to recreate that supportive pseudo-familial network that he had with Lady Mar at Stirling. So he's always looking for someone who is on his side. And I think you see that with the men he will fall in love with. They're often someone that he wants them to be his
Yeah.
and not beholden to another political faction. The other way that the childhood manifests itself is that he is more than intellectually prepared to be a monarch. He's very gifted with that. With the exception of his love life, he's also very good at hiding his feelings and lying. He learns to lie to sort of keep Buchanan quiet and to please Morton when he comes to visit. So he's a talented liar when
Mm.
it comes to getting what he wants politically. He the last thing that I think it gives him, he is someone who is very, very loyal when it comes to those who support him and look after him. And that I think comes from always hoping that he would have a support network in the way that, most of the families at Stirling, most of the families playing the Game of Thrones, if you like, in 16th century Scotland, had these very elaborate and loyal and extended family kinship networks. The Stuart dynasty doesn't have that. There's just been a catastrophic run of bad luck, and there are
Mm.
so few of them left that James, when he's about 11 or 12, is starting to reach out to his father's cousins, distant relatives who he hopes he can promote to form a bedrock of support. So there's very much, to me, the sense of a child who, yes, sorry, a man who had been a child, who has experienced great emotional difficulties and pain, but at the same time has also, I think, learnt that you have to have people around you who you can support, and that even a king cannot ever fully trust those around him unless he has a loyalist base behind him.
And what do you think was the impact of his mother's imprisonment? Obviously, for is it 2 decades, Gareth? I can't quite remember,
Yeah,
but a very long time in England. You mentioned that she has to flee to England. How do you think that kind of shaped his political mind, I suppose?
yeah, he's just short of his 21st birthday when she's executed.
Right.
And the chapter it's dealt with in chapter five in the book about how he responds to the very real chance and then the actuality that she's going to be beheaded in Elizabeth the First's orders. James has a very confused, and I think for him confusing, attitude toward his mother. On the one hand, there's no memory of her. On the other, he has spent years in George Buchanan's childhood hearing an excruciating and often inaccurate detail what a horrible person she had been. And yet, when he was 11, there was quite a popular um, pamphlet, let's call it, that circulated in Northern Europe called the Bothwell Testament. That was allegedly a deathbed confession by his stepfather, Lord Bothwell, in Denmark, in which Bothwell had claimed that Mary had nothing to do with Lord Darnley's death and it had all been his idea. The Bothwell Testament might be a forgery, but that doesn't really matter from James's perspective. He is delighted to read it and tells all his servants that he's thrilled to hear Buchanan had been lying and that he knew his mother wasn't this bad of a person. That's really the high point. And then he starts to write to Mary more often. And there are some instances where she lies to him about her intentions and he becomes a bit more jaded towards her, but then it's a it runs in cycles and peaks and troughs. And from a political perspective, he's never really quite sure what's best because on the one hand, Mary is potentially a liability. If she ever comes back to Scotland, it would split the country between those who supported her, who would have been the minority, but potentially an influential minority. But also, she is his link. She's his dynastic link to the claim to the English throne. There's an interesting letter I found where he writes to Elizabeth's favorite, Robert Dudley, where I think he came as close as he ever could to summarizing how Mary shaped his views. And he said, "My religion ever moved me to hate her course, but honor constrains me to save her life." And so I think, yes, I think I think by the time Mary is in real difficulty, James is very distrustful of her, but he also, I think, is genuinely horrified when she's executed.
And just thinking about Elizabeth, so, she was quite reluctant, obviously, to name a successor, So how does he get to the throne? What is the sort of path that gets him there in the end?
One of the joys about writing about something like this is that you get to see someone you've written about from a different perspective. So I've written
Yeah.
about Elizabeth briefly in her childhood in my biography of her stepmother, Katherine Howard, and also there were chapters on her in the palace. And I admire Elizabeth a lot. I think she was an extraordinary and gifted monarch. And I think there were many more points, for me anyway, in her favor than against her. But when you are writing it from James's perspective, you do see, or at least I hope you can see, why he found her so annoying. And that she micromanages him. She sends advice, but really orders about who his advisors should be. And at one point, James does snap and say, "You should be no more concerned about my counselors than I am about yours," and has to remind her sometimes that he is a fellow monarch and not her subservient. The way he gets to the throne is nerve-wracking for him. At one point, he's having nightmares that Elizabeth will outlive him. But there are also quite a few claimants. And really, the 1570s, when James is still in his teens, clears the deck for him. And you have the running um, tragedies of the Grey sisters that take
Mm.
them out. You in the 1580s will have his mother going out. In the 1570s, you have the collapse of Elizabeth's last serious marriage proposal with the Duke of Anjou. So one by one, the competition falls. But there are still, because of Henry VIII's chaotic private life and will, the consequences are reverberating half a century later. And while James is the best candidate to be the next monarch, he is by no means the only one. So he puts that talent to dissimulation to good use and sets up a secret spy ring with Elizabeth's later Chief Minister Robert Cecil and various prominent figures in the English upper class who will support him becoming King of England and Ireland when Elizabeth dies. And they write to each other in code. Some of the letters are burned, but we have enough that survive to know that James was 3030 in the code network. And the agreement that they come to is that when Elizabeth is dead, Robert Cecil will send a particular ring north of the border. Sources disagree which ring it is. It probably was one that belonged to an ally to the Cecil faction who worked for Elizabeth called Philadelphia Scroop, which is a brilliant name.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's Harry Potter-esque. But yeah, so Philadelphia Scroop is the one who's going to get the ring, and it will be carried north by Robert Carey, Mary Boleyn's grandson. And that is what happens in the spring of 1603. That is how James is to know it's not a trap, and that he
Mhm.
has succeeded Elizabeth. She is dead, and he has been proclaimed king. So it's a lot of there's a lot of groundwork because Elizabeth can't find out about this because she'd be, as you say, quite displeased.
Quite cranky, cranky Elizabeth. Now, we're about to venture into, for me, Gareth, foreign territory.
Sure.
I am much more comfortable in in the Tudor reign, obviously. But to sort of ease me into it, can you tell me a little bit about the sort of differences and similarities, perhaps, between the Tudor and Stuart courts before we look more closely at James's reign?
Yes, so it's fascinating, and he was solely King of Scots up until he was in his mid-30s, and the Scottish court is different. So, one misconception that I think a lot of us have, and I certainly had years ago when I started studying the court, was that the French court was more formal than the English, which it wasn't. The English was more formal. It is much later, really under Louis XIV, that etiquette becomes God and king at the French court, and it becomes a little bit more Spanish in the way it's implemented. So the French court does have a very elaborate code of manners, how you hold a cup, how you walk, how you dance. There's a certain sort of chic quality to them. However, they do have a quite fluid access level to the monarch. So it's much more common at the French court for there to be good conversation. The gentlemen of the king's household or the ladies of the queen's household will be able to sit with them at meals. There's more conversation really at the French court. And the Scottish court is much more similar to the French model than it is to the much more rigid rules at the English court. And there are many English observers from James's lifetime who visit the Scottish court who can see that it's more like France and actually think it's too relaxed. So the other big difference between the English and Scottish monarchy is income. So the English monarchy in the 16th and 17th century has an income that's about 19 or 20 times higher than the Scottish crowns for a variety of reasons. One of which is that a lot of the crown lands in the south of England are very agriculturally fertile. But also, the aristocracy in Scotland is much more influential than their English counterparts. And it really is the aristocracy who has the majority of the land. The Stuarts don't really have that much in comparison to what some of the great clan families possess. So the Scottish court is more relaxed than the English, and it's smaller as a result of it. It's also smaller through those series of dynastic accidents I was talking about. One of which is that up until James's second cousin, Henrietta Stuart, moves to Scotland from France and marries the Marquis of Huntly in sort of political marriage, there are no women at it. James's mother is in exile, his grandmother is dead, he has no sisters, and he has no legitimate aunts or even female cousins. And that makes the court smaller still. There are no internal households, if you like. There's no queen's household or princess's household. There is one household centered on a young king. And Henrietta and her sister Marie will change that to a degree. Really, the big change is when James marries in 1590 to Anna of Denmark. But the final difference is that the Scottish court does have quite prominent, there's sort of the heavy hitter palaces, if you like. Holyrood House is the main residence for the capital, and they have magnificent homes like Linlithgow Palace, where his mother was born, and Falkland Palace. But they are on the move almost even more than the English royal
Mm.
household is because hunting is a massive part of the Scottish royal routine. James, I would say the eighth love of his life was hunting. I mean, he is a brilliant horseman. People will notice like he'll end up with his arm in a sling because he came off his horse horse and didn't notice the pain because he was so caught up with the hunting. And the Stuart court eats what it kills. Hunting serves a really practical purpose. So it's smaller, it runs on less money, it's perhaps more intimate, and there's certainly more of a forthright back and forth in conversation than you would find at the Tudor court south
Mm,
of the border.
that's really fascinating. And I do want to talk about Anna of Denmark in a moment, but just
Yeah.
before we do that, so what kind of ruler is James? How would you describe him as a king?
He, as King of Scots, he is exceptional. He is, I think, one of the great Stuart kings. He, the circumstances he comes to adult kingship in are, to put it mildly, difficult. He is very shrewd. He can swallow his dislike and pair up with families that maybe irritate him. There are setbacks, one of which does come from his love life, and the rumors start to leak into the public sphere. It is early to early 20s.
Mm.
It is the point at which there are pamphlets appearing in Edinburgh referring to him as the Buggerer King, and they're fairly criticizing his love for men as the reason he's late in getting married. But broadly speaking, he is a man who weathers many crises, and I think he sees the crises as signs that he's not a good king. He constantly says that that Scotland was tough, but I don't think he ever gave himself credit in the way many of his Scottish contemporaries did give him credit, that actually the crises are inevitable, surviving them is not. And he stabilizes the economy, he makes a series of excellent foreign policy decisions. But as King of England and as King of Ireland, there are more mistakes. One of them is I don't think he fully understands, or sorry, he does understand. He just doesn't have patience with the complexity of English government. He thinks the ubiquitousness of Parliament is ridiculous. Because his manners are, more to the point, he offends a lot of people in England who are used to the much more sort of manners conscious Elizabeth I. And because of the difference in income, he sort of loses his mind when it comes to money and he comes to England. He can't stop spending. He admits himself later the first 3 years were like Christmas every day. But I think also the difficulties he'd gone through catch up with him. And his health does start to take a pretty serious decline from about 16, 17 onwards. There are more falls from the horse, but this time he's not young enough to recover from them quickly. He's definitely drinking too much towards the end of his life. But again, unlike either his son or his mother, he dies on the throne and in his bed. So ultimately a successful king, but I think a more successful king of Scots than a king of England.
And so once he becomes King of England and he's King of England and King of Scots, does he remain in England? Is that his base from then on?
He does. It's not the intention. Initially, he had said that he would be back in Scotland every 3 years. As it turns out, he only goes back once in 1617. Quite interestingly, his lover at the time, George Villiers, writes that he'd never seen him happier or in better health than when he was in Scotland. But I don't know whether the fact that the gunpowder plot happened so soon before the first trip back to Scotland would have been whether he could see how unpopular he was becoming in England and actually worried about leaving it for a period of time. I don't know whether it was just laziness or the cost of it, or there was always something else to do. But he only goes back once in 1617, and I think that was a big mistake. It's certainly it creates an heir to the throne in Charles who does not know and does not understand Scotland, and that will later have massive and negative consequences for the Stuart monarchy.
And let's talk about Anna of Denmark. So, what was his relationship like with her, and when does she become aware of her husband's sexuality? You obviously said that there were rumors since he was quite a young man. And how does she respond?
She is remarkable. She's one of my favorite people to write about. She's such a vibrant force of personality, wildly extravagant. I mean, she sort of and the way she carries out a grudge is like a sort of 1980s soap opera villain, which I quite enjoyed. She is the second daughter of the late King Frederick II of Denmark, and she's very charming, and she's will become a very important patron of the arts. She's a very shrewd player of court politics. One of the things I loved the most was finding out about her was that when she moved to Scotland, she pretended she was learning Scots And she pretended to her staff that she was still struggling with it for about 6 months after she'd become fluent, so she could hear what they were saying about her behind her back. It's how two ladies in waiting ended up with no job. So she was a she was intelligent, glamorous, and from every account I could read, very charming. And while she wasn't overly popular in Scotland, she would become beloved in England. When she finds out, I think is relatively late in the marriage. So James, I uncovered some quite interesting evidence, touching evidence in a way, actually, that in preparation for the marriage, he separates from a man he's in love with, Alexander Lindsay, and arranges a marriage for him. And Lindsay all of a sudden sort of retreats from court. And from the letters I find, it does look as if Lindsay, I think he was struggling quite seriously with James marrying, but they both knew they needed to. And James, no, what I will say is that the evidence might have been destroyed, but all I can say is I found no evidence for quite a few years after the wedding that he had a male lover or favorite. It's just not, there are no sources that would lead me to indicate that. As I say, they may have been destroyed, but you can't speculate too much on an absence of evidence. My instinct is that she probably didn't realize until maybe about 7 or 8 years in,
Right.
maybe longer. I mean, she definitely knows by 1603, which is the 13 years into the marriage. I think a really credible case can be made that she knew in the summer of 1600. Whether that was a point of realization or whether it was the point at which it became obvious, I don't know. That's all I can say. And it's because there is heavy speculation about James and a gentleman of the court called Alexander Riven. And there's a scandal that sort of is the 11th chapter of the book. And there's a lot of talk in public amongst the Scottish people about what was going on and what had happened. And I do think that 1600 for me is the credible turning point. How she reacts to it, certainly the royal marriage in the autumn and winter of 1600 is not a happy one. Whether that's because of that is unclear. But she does take herself off to Dunfermline, and James is very apologetic and trying to win back her good graces. But by about 1603, she has clearly decided that she has been dealt quite a good hand in this, and she's going to play it to maximum personal advantage. She knows that, unlike her mother, the Queen Sophia in Denmark, she's never going to have to endure a mistress arising to rival her, and her children are never going to have to endure the social plague of illegitimate half siblings, potentially rivaling them. And so Anna really negotiates what seems to be a deal with herself and with her husband, which, without being too reductive, is blank check, please, to run my household and fund my love of the arts and her, I mean, utterly staggering jewelry collection that I don't think coincidentally becomes the largest in Europe. But also she insists that whoever these favorites are, that they are never to disrespect her, otherwise they have to go. And I was so surprised to find that it is in the spring of 1603, just after the move to England, that she allies with James's new chief minister, Sir Robert Cecil, and they pick the next favourite. They back someone called Sir James Hay, who was a member of James's bedchamber staff, and a Scotsman, French educated, good looking, really good hunter. And there's some fascinating, notes from this period. The Countess of Suffolk, who was a member of the Howard faction, is saying, we have to find someone really good looking for the king. He can't stand bad breath. So when she finds a candidate, she's curling their hair to the latest style and giving them sort of freshening their perfuming their breath. That's how it's put. And she finds apparently a fantastic facial that will knock years off you, but essentially it's possets and curd that she makes them put in their face. So they're all sort of falling over themselves at the English court to find a favourite to seduce the king. And Anna backs James Hay. Unfortunately, she kind of backs the wrong horse, and James ends up falling in love with the heir to the Welsh earldom of Pembroke. Love might be stretching it, but certainly lust with Philip Herbert. But later, she is absolutely instrumental in knocking out one of his later favourites and promoting probably the most famous of them, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, who she refers to as my dog in their private correspondence. So she is someone who makes the best of the situation. And her and James have an excellent friendship. The letters they write to each other, making fun of various insufferable members of their court, are very, very funny, which you don't expect to laugh in an archive, to
No,
be
yeah.
completely honest. But they did. They made me laugh.
Oh, I like her. She sounds fabulous. And
I love her.
yeah, she does. She sounds great. And I want to talk about an incident that you recounted. So an attempt on James's life. Can you tell us, or an alleged attempt on James's life?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, there are many, and there's a kidnapping incident when he's 16 that I think leaves probably
Oh,
the
one a
most
little bit
severe.
later, I think. This was the one I,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, there is. Yes, so the this sort of the parent, literally the parent to the attempted assassination attempt in that the kidnapping attempt when he was 16 was by the
Oh,
father of the man
oh my
who.
goodness.
When I say it's the parent to it, I mean that in every sense of the word. And so that one, the rate of Riven, James never, I think psychologically never fully recovers from. It really, I think it was one of the great traumas of his life because he was happy and contented, and some of the men who backed that attempted kidnapping have been some of the men who raised him and whom he trusted completely. And it is led by a Scottish aristocrat called the Earl of Gowrie, surname Riven, although spelled Ruthven. And to sort of, there's something running in the family because his father had been the one who led the attack that killed David Rizzio.
Oh
So
gosh.
this Earl of Gowrie, once he kidnaps James, assumes control of the Scottish government. James later escapes, mounts a counter coup, has Gowrie executed, and just briefly destroys the family, but eventually decides it's not the children's fault and welcomes some of them back to court. And one of them is Alexander Riven, about whom there is quite fevered speculation, and who I think is the gateway to Anna knowing about her husband's
Hmm.
sexuality. So in the summer of 1600, when James is in his early 30s, they're on a hunting trip, and Alexander invites James to spend the afternoon at his family home, sort of break for lunch. And after lunch, Alexander suggests that him and James have some alone time together. And the rest, there's about 16 men in the royal entourage, go outside and relax in the courtyard. It's a beautiful day. Alexander takes James up to the topmost room of the tallest tower, Gowrie House, and he locks each door as they go. And considering James's fear of another kidnapping, the fact that he doesn't seem to object will later be one of the pieces of evidence that no one can satisfactorily explain away, least of all James. And something happens in that room that leads to James sort of flinging the window open and screaming treason, treason, treason to the men below, and they break in. They can't find the keys. They have to batter the doors down, get up, and they find James holding Alexander Riven at bay with a knife. And John Ramsay, who's a very loyal gentleman to James, runs Alexander through and kills him. And because Alexander is part of a very prominent noble family, there's no covering this up, and there's also no shortage of suspects. Some people think James staged the whole thing to extract revenge from the family. Some people think that Alexander had been attempting to finish what his father had started. But the question is, what did he say to get him into a room on his own? Why, when
Yeah.
James didn't get going, why? And why did no one think this was all? Why did the men in the entourage seem to think this was normal? So James comes up with a really, I mean, I say he was a good liar, but every brilliant footballer has a terrible match, and this was his terrible match. And he says that Alexander had told him that at the top of the tower that he had found a crock of gold, and that they were going to go and get it. And the joke in Scotland that the crock of gold is a crock of something else entirely is not slow on anyone's lips. And the general consensus is that Alexander lured James upstairs with the promise of sexual intimacy. Writing that chapter in the book, Crock of Gold, I rewrote it about 5 times because it's such a thrilling and interesting story, and we still don't know what happened. Known unto God, as they say. And I think so. Eventually, I was like, look, I love a Poirot mystery. So what I will do is I will structure it like a murder mystery, and I will tell you what happened, and then I will present to the reader the 5 explanations about what happened in that room, and you can decide which one you think is the most convincing. And so for me, it was I have one that I think is the most likely, but there are 2 or 3 that I think are credible. So that James, I don't think is in any doubt that it was a legitimate threat in his life. But Whether it was or it wasn't, I'm still unconvinced. It certainly seems to be that Anna, like many people in Scotland, I think the reason you went and were okay with him locking the door is because there was a sexual
Mm,
intention.
yeah. Oh, well, I think everyone needs to run off and buy the book so they can read all the five different theories. So, of course, the book is called The Life and Loves of Britain's
Mhm.
First King. So I do want to talk about some of his loves now. So tell us about some of those relationships slash affairs that he has with men at his court and those that he did, well, that it appears that he fell in love with.
Yeah, well, there are three before the marriage. So there are three between the ages of sort of 17 and 24. And I was determined that this book wasn't going to sort of treat Scotland as a prologue because half his life was there. But I was also very aware that the bulk of the evidence of very specific sexual and romantic letters belonged to later relationships he had when he was living in England. So what I thought I was going to do was I would, present to the reader, here are some favorites in Scotland. The evidence is not there. We do know that he was sexually attracted and romantically attracted to men. It's possible that something happened here. I was quite surprised that there is actually pretty substantial and convincing evidence, specific evidence, I would say, of the earlier love affairs. The one on whom there is the least specific evidence, and I always try to be clear about this in the book, is the first when James is 17, a man called Patrick Gray. And Patrick is really the first person who rockets through the hierarchy of the household and who isn't a relative. And he's noted for being preeminently beautiful, and he does seem to be James's favorite for until James is turned about 20. But I had to be very clear with the reader. Look, I think it's the most likely explanation is this, but specific out and out identification of Patrick as his lover is rare. That there's just general sort of snide comments about Patrick. Uh, Patrick, however, is obviously important enough that Elizabeth I recruits him to keep her abreast of what's happening in Scotland. The second was someone who I initially went in and thought nothing had happened, and it was just that James was besotted with him. He was the Marquis of Huntly, the head chief of Clan Gordon. And in October 1587, when James is 21 and Huntley's 25, there is a source that outright states that they are lovers. It does it with quite a sly dig and basically insinuates this guy, the man who wrote it, hates Huntley and insinuates that hot and hardy Huntley, who's said to be the second best looking man in the Scottish aristocracy, certainly one of the wealthiest, and a man not afflicted with low self-esteem, is he sort of basically says he's using the king and he'd rather be sleeping with a woman.
Mm.
But it's also from Huntley that we have the first letter, sorry, to Huntley, that we have the first letter from James that clearly steps beyond the Platonic. So it is true that aristocrats at the time will write in much more expressive language to their friends
Yes.
than we would. So you have to set that really as firmly as one can in context. And so this is not Platonic in context. He writes to Huntley after Huntley's return to his estates in the Highland, saying, "Since the moment you have left me, I have not been one moment unthinking of you, except when I go to sleep, and scarcely even then." So that doesn't fit into the into the
Mm.
rhetoric of and also it's the first time we see James get jealous. The third is the one that we have the most evidence for, which is a hunting companion called Alexander Lindsay, who unusually for 16th century politics is just a fundamentally good person and keeps himself out of politics. And he is the one who seems to have been a universal understanding at the Scottish court that they were lovers. And the best source comes from a mutual friend of him and James called Lord Hume. These are affairs that have many of the same ingredients that the famous ones in England will have. He is a one-man man. Mostly, he does seem to kind of, I think particularly with Alexander Lindsay, I think falls in love. I think that's the first love that we see. But with Huntley, we do also see the first time where James will let his lust or his attractions overrule his good sense. Huntley is a political vortex of ambition. And, I ended up liking Huntley more than I did at the start, but he certainly does, play fast and loose with political safety. He's sort of punch first, ask questions later kind of guy. And James habitually forgives him. In fact, there's one absolutely extraordinary incident where Huntley is detained in 1588 at Edinburgh Castle because they find evidence that he was writing to Philip II of Spain saying, if you want to use my deep water ports to bring the Armada here, you know, and go to England from here. And James is incandescent where he says, if Elizabeth ever finds out that I or thinks that I thought that was okay, we'll be at war. And Elizabeth would be well within her rights to do that. And certainly I'll never succeed her as king. And Huntley asks, can he come and explain in person? James initially says no, then has him in his rooms in Edinburgh Castle. And people in the room say James threw himself at him, kissing him to the surprise of many, and then invites him to spend the night, which he does. And then the next morning announces to the council that he's changed his mind and that the letters weren't real and Huntley's fine. So yes, so what charms Huntley had, I don't know, but they were certainly considerable. And you will see a lot of this in England. So Philip Herbert, his first favorite when he's in England, is a return to the more apolitical favorites. No one objects to him really because he gets an earldom, but he keeps himself out of politics, doesn't make enemies. His later two, Robert Carr, the Earl of Somerset, and George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, are much more of the type of favourite you will expect. They do become socially and politically influential, staggeringly wealthy, particularly after Queen Anne's death. Buckingham is in 1619, Buckingham's consort in function, if not in name. James starts even to refer to him in their love letters as my darling wife. And they are the favourites that are most famous, partly because there's more evidence and also because they're more spectacularly successful monetarily from their time as James's favourite. But what was also, I think, an explanation to why they become more significant, particularly Buckingham, is that James's health is deteriorating. And whereas previously he tried to keep favourites out of politics, now I think he wants someone, as we mentioned earlier, loyal and completely on his side, who he can trust to deputise for him in certain governmental functions. So those relationships change over the course of his life. But apart from, I mean, there's this pervasive idea that if you are predominantly homosexual, you or bisexual, that you mightn't be able to perform with a woman, which is sort of definitely not the point of bisexuality. But there is this idea that James's pregnancies with his wife prove that he wasn't having sex with these men, despite the evidence that we have from the letters where they describe doing it. Um, I do think that there were strong feelings for his wife, but I if I had to use modern terminology, I think I would describe him as bisexual with an overwhelming preference for his own gender.
Mhm.
But I think other people would push it further down the Kinsey scale. I mean, but ultimately, what I do in the book is I just describe the relationships, and the
Yeah.
reader can make up their own mind how they would label him. Sometimes I think we tie ourselves in knots over them.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And so, how did his contemporaries then view his private life and the choices he were making? Because it sounds like they were quite out in the open and public, especially later
Yeah.
in his reign.
Yes, James hates the public talking about it, but he doesn't mind the court. And I don't think I think that's another difference between the Scottish and the English court, in that the Scottish court, because it's so much smaller, there is a more intense loyalty within it, and they don't tend to blab their secrets to the wider population. If something's smaller, you can keep secrets much more easily. The English court is massive. I mean, the royal households are the second largest employers in the city of London, apart from the ports. I mean, so of course things will seep out to
Mhm.
the public much more easily. I I find a range of reactions. Some people, I think it's important to note actually, in some more, say, Puritan or even provincial communities, people didn't know what homosexuality was. I think it's very difficult for us to fully understand. But I think back even to, like my great grandparents or like the generation that believed Liberace was heterosexual. Like, I mean, if you think it's not that long ago, it is within living memory that people could see what seems to us very clear evidence and not know what they were seeing.
Mhm.
And there is a couple of instances where visitors to James's court from those communities are confused. Some of them say that James must have forgotten these gentlemen's gender because he's treating them like women. Others say, he was hugging the Earl very seriously. I mean, there's almost a touching naivety to it.
Mm.
Among those that know, there is disgust. There are cases, for instance, Sir Henry Rich turns down a position in James's household because he doesn't want anyone to think that he owed his career to a sexual relationship with the king. We do know that there are legal advisors, lawyers attached to the court who refer to it as the darling sin of courtiers, and they do say that they have every reason to believe it's a sin practiced by the king. There are those who, as the Countess of Suffolk or Sir Robert Cecil, know all about it, don't seem to have a problem with it, even try to use it to their own advantage. And there are also those who don't really care.
Mm.
And Lord Hume, I think who I mentioned earlier, is in that category. Their only gripe is when the favourite crosses from the bedchamber into the council chamber. And that, I think, is why, particularly if you look at the English era favourites, although they're almost like a portrait of the Union. Philip Herbert's from a Welsh aristocratic family, Robert Carr's from a Scottish one, George Villiers is English. But no one objects to Philip Herbert. The Howards are a bit sniffy about him because they wanted one of their own to get it, and they only refer to him as the Welsh Earl in their letters. But the Howards, that sort of tracks that they would be. But and Robert Carr, when the relationship first starts, Robert is no one objects. The first few years he keeps himself out of politics. Then he starts to move into to government, and that's when people get really angry.
Mm.
The last avenue of reaction is Parliament, and it's what's fascinating, particularly with the 1610 and the 1614 Parliament in England, is that they do seem to know because they come so unbelievably close to saying it in their speeches. So cock, for instance, would have had the same meaning as slang then as it does today. And at one point, when they're talking about funding the royal household, one of the members of parliament refers to it as a cistern. And it's a very odd, lumbering speech until he gets to the metaphor at the end, where he says, why should we refill this cistern when every day the king allows it to be drained with a private cock?
Mm.
And the Speaker of the House does shut the speech down very quickly. There are ones that are more pun related. The monarchy has wants because of the king's wantons, but and there's laughter when this is said. So Parliament, and also there's a play called The Isle of Gulls that mocks a totally fictitious ancient Greek king who's very clearly supposed to be James, and he's shown cavorting on stage with his male favorites who are ancient Greek in the script, but all the actors play them with Scottish accents. So there's a full range of reactions to it.
And just to start wrapping this up, Gareth, because you've been already so generous with your time, can you just summarize for us the man that you came to know in your research?
Yeah, sharp edges. I'm not someone who thinks that every time you become a biographer, you have to become the person's
I
champion.
think you
You
said
should
that about Catherine Howard, didn't you? Sharp edges?
Yeah,
I think you
yeah.
did at one
I mean,
point.
yeah. I mean, I mean, her sharp edges are much softer. I don't think I really knew
So,
what sharp edges were until I read about James. Yeah, Catherine did have sort of quite mild sharp edges, as in, I mean, no, sorry, that's not true. Threatening to fire a maid because she couldn't understand your ever-changing instructions is actually quite bad
it's pretty
behavior.
sharp.
Yeah, that's sharp. It's not witch hunt sharp though. So I think
No.
so it's you learn your different sharpness. But yeah, Catherine did have sharp edges, and James had sharper edges. But even I say the witch hunts, his
Mm.
attitude to those changed, and eventually he was intervening to shut them down. I think he was incredibly complex, which from a biographer's perspective is wonderful. He was intellectually a genius. He was a liar. He could be very vindictive, and he could be very, very kind. I think in some ways he probably was broken before he was fully formed by the events of his childhood, and certainly that kidnapping attempt at 16. But I liked him more at the end than I thought I would. I was, writing his death, I thought of all the lives he had saved. I mean, that you cannot take away from the fact that those 70 people who died in the North Berwick witch hunts, yes, he didn't start that witch hunt, but he did eventually become a supporter of it. And you cannot get away from the horror and the savagery of that.
Mm.
But also, I thought of all the lives he'd saved and the thousands of lives he had saved when, despite public opinion and pressure from Parliament and international pressure, and even pressure from his lover Buckingham and his own family, he would not get the British states involved in the European War, known as the 30 Years' War later. And it was one of the most devastating sectarian conflicts in Europe. It caused the population of Germany to collapse by about 50%. It led to about 6 million casualties. No country that got involved in it was left unscathed. And James said that he had been a king who promoted peace all his life, and this is partly where the nickname Queen James at the time came from. It was a pun on his private life and on the foreign policy that favored peace over war. And those two aspects, his personal life lived boldly and unusually,
Mhm.
and a refusal to take the country into a devastating war, are, I think, 2 points in his favor, massive points in his favor. So a nuanced, difficult, but thrillingly interesting man.
And so, just out of curiosity, if you
Yeah.
had to pick one court, Gareth, so I know you've spent time immersed in the Henrician court and the Stuart court. If you had to pick Henry VIII's court or James's court, which one would you choose?
To live in, or right up, actually, to
To
live
live
in,
in, to
James.
work in, yes, close proximity to the king.
James. No
Mhm.
doubt, no question. I mean, they are all the Jacobeans are all fairly awful, but James isn't.
Yeah.
And there is not, when you fall at the Jacobean court, it is very rare for you to end up dead.
Mm.
Not unheard of, but rare. Whereas with Henry VIII, it is remarkable if you're still alive. I mean, if you look at, this is not to insult Mary Boleyn or Catherine Parr or until Mary Cranmer, but if you look at what are criteria for referring to someone as a successful member of the Tudor elite, all we require them to do is live.
Keep your head down.
It's like, Mary Boleyn survived. You're like, that Henry set the bar so staggeringly low. But all we need you to do is be breathing naturally by the end of your life, and we will count it as a success. And that is a testament to none of not Cranmer or Mary Boleyn or Catherine Parr. That is a testament to just how unhinged life was at Henry's court. Whereas with James, I think they were quite unpleasant, but he was not someone who believed you should pay for mistakes with your life.
Love it. And the very last thing, of course, is the
Yep.
takeaway that I ask all my guests. So perhaps this can be a Stuart takeaway. So something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode that might, nurture their love of the Stuart court.
Yeah, I mean, certainly would go back to the point if you're traveling, Stirling Castle is the
Yes.
one to go and look at. It is up. I cannot sing its praises sufficiently highly. I suppose I'm trying to think of a good uh, story or something to look at. I mean, I think the gunpowder plot is a
Hmm.
really brilliant window in, and also. Actually, a good life to look at. It's James's daughter-in-law, Henrietta Maria France, is really fascinating and gives you a good window into so many things that were happening in the 17th century. So if you want to go have a look at another story apart from James or one that whets your appetite with the 17th century, I have a takeaway with Henrietta Maria, Charles the First's wife.
Love it. Love it all. And so where can people find out more about you, Gareth?
Well, I'm active on Instagram underscore Gareth Russell. It's the verified account, so it's if it's anyone else that's not
So
me.
there's no fake
Uh,
Gareths out there.
Yeah, yeah. Now, there was a weird. There was one. I mean, you always get one, but I mean, to be honest, like I mean, it's a history account. You're not going to find anything particularly scandalous there about anyone who's been anything less than dead for 200 years. But yeah, underscore Gareth Russell, and then on Facebook, I'm Gareth Russell, historian and author. I have a podcast, Single Malt History, though it's taking its season 5 break until we're back in November. So with the back catalogs up, if anyone's interested.
Oh, wonderful. And I very much look forward to the next book project. Is there any news on that?
Yeah, not at the minute.
Not at the minute.
But James has sort of consumed my life, and the way it's been received has been very exciting. So we've had lots of trips to talk about it. But yeah, I think
Cool.
soon we'll have to start to to repivot, but not fully decided yet what to do.
Oh, maybe we can lure you back to the 16th
Yeah,
century.
maybe
We'll send
back
out
to the old one.
vibes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me and coming back on the podcast. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, anytime, Natalie, really. Thank you very much.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining me. If you've enjoyed the show, please spread the word on your socials and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join the Talking Tudors Patreon community for some fun, exclusive content and the Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind the scenes news. You'll also find me on Instagram. My handle is themosthappy78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.